Hey everybody, Coach Toolshed here, and in today's video I'm going to be bringing you my review for Guardians of the Galaxy. And as with all reviews here on Coach Toolshed Gaming, you can rest assured that I've taken the time to fully beat the game before posting my review. In the case of Guardians of the Galaxy, I've taken the time to get the Platinum Trophy for the game on a PlayStation 5, so I've seen pretty much everything that the game has to offer. So without further ado, let's dive into my review for Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy. Now, first and foremost, let me tell you where I'm coming from with this game. I'm not someone who is a huge MCU fan. I've only seen one of the Guardian movies. I've only seen a handful of the different Marvel movies over the past decade, so I could really take it or leave it when it comes to that. I'm not someone who is waiting in line for the next movie to come out. I haven't read the comics, so I'm not involved with the backstory. I don't know a lot of the lore about the Guardians, but I will say if you've seen the movies, if you're a fan of it, you will find a lot here that is very similar. The way the characters portray themselves, the way they play off one another, and their personalities does hold true to what you would probably know from the MCU movies. So when it comes to reviewing the game, I'm going to be doing just that, reviewing the game. It's not going to be getting any extra bonus points for me because these are Marvel characters or the Guardian characters. That really doesn't mean a whole lot to me at all. If I had to compare this game structurally to another franchise that you might be more familiar with as a gamer, it would be the Uncharted franchise. This is a very story-focused game, a lot of cinematics, lots of cutscenes, although it does actually have some dialogue choices that you can make, which we'll get into that in a little bit later, but this is very much a linear, chapter-based, story-focused game, and there's going to be some combat interspersed throughout, but it's mostly focused on telling a story. So, right off, if that's not something that interests you, just be aware that's what you're getting into. This isn't a grand open world adventure or anything like that. It's not even a sectioned off sort of open world. Once you go through an area, you're not going back unless you come back again in a different chapter where the area will be changed around. Something different has happened, something has occurred. There will be a few times throughout the game that you will be tasked with going back to areas that you've already been to, but again, there's no open world segments. Once you go through a door or something collapses behind you, there's no going back. You're just propelling yourself forward through the story. That being said, the story itself is actually pretty good. I was actually very surprised at how well written it was in certain spots. I actually got a few chuckles out of it. I wasn't rolling over on the floor dying laughing, but it did crack a smile a few times, got a couple chuckles out of me, and there were actually some very good emotional cutscenes throughout the game. It told a pretty good, cohesive story. It had a solid plot. The characters, on the whole, were good. I don't really have much to complain about story-wise. I'm not going to get into spoilers or anything, but in general, I think if you do like the Guardians, I think you'll find a lot here as far as the storytelling that you will enjoy. For the most part, I did like all the voice acting that was done in the game. The only problem that I had with the voice acting is I didn't love the main character, Peter Quill, Star-Lord. I didn't love the voice actor that they chose for that, but in general, all the rest of them, I didn't have a problem with. I do like the characters. I like the way they play off one another. I like how they're combative at first, but they do, they gel together as the game goes on. It was pretty typical as far as that goes. You're not going to have any massive surprises as far as that goes. And even in the story, there weren't really any major twists or anything. It just told a solid, coherent story that made sense and was actually pretty well executed. I have to hand it to him. One thing that you will also find, which I was a little bit surprised by, is the sheer amount of dialogue that these characters have. Again, going back to what I said about Uncharted, if you played those games, you'll know that you're always going to have at least probably one or two companions with you through most of the game, and they're going to be going off with banter back and forth, talking to you, talking to each other. This game does that in droves. The Guardians do not shut up the entire time. So just be aware of that. They are constantly going to be going back. Again, this holds true to how they interact in the movies. They are always bantering with one another, going back and forth. Some of them fighting, some of them agreeing with one another. That you got Rocket and Groot who are friends, and then the other ones are kind of at each other's throat. But that's how the Guardians interact. That's just how they are as characters. They hold true to what exactly you were going to expect. There's not really a ton of surprises with the story, but it is really, in general, pretty solid. One other thing I want to mention before I get into the gameplay itself is the soundtrack. This game is loaded with tracks from the 80s, so if you're a fan of the old 80s song, whether it be Motley Crue or a little Rick Astley, Never Gonna Give You Up, you get some Gary Newman, you get Tainted Love, you get all sorts of different 80s songs, you get Wham! I mean, there's just, the list goes on. There's dozens upon dozens upon dozens of different 80s songs that this game will play throughout, both during combat and during cutscenes when you're on the ship. All throughout the game, you're going to be bombarded with 80s tracks. I think they used it very well throughout the game, and it definitely adds a bit of a unique flair. You don't really hear a lot of games that have that sort of 80s soundtrack to them outside of, say, maybe Vice City, which of course came out about 20 years ago at this point. So you don't get too many games that have that style of soundtrack. I thought it was fun. It added some levity to the game, and of course we all know that it fits in with the character again of Star-Lord. He listens to that music throughout the movies as well. So it was pretty fun when you're flying the ship listening to Flock of Seagulls. You know, it's just, it adds a little bit of extra fun to the game. I think they did a good job getting all these different licensed tracks. So good job there from the developer. Now, let's get into the gameplay itself, because this is where things start to get a little bit not so great. The game in general handles very well the character controls. You're only going to be controlling Peter Quill, aka Star-Lord, throughout the game. You don't control the other characters directly. You do issue commands to them in combat. That's where most of the problem is going to come in. But in general, the character does respond, does what you want it to do. He handles pretty well, so the controls themselves are pretty well executed as far as just movement goes. He doesn't move very fast at times when he doesn't have his boosters equipped on his boots. When he does, he has a little dash so he can move around a lot quicker. But if you're just in some dialogue sections where you're just going to be walking forward, it can get a little bit slow going. And a lot of that is because they're trying to cram a lot of dialogue in. Again, like I said, their characters just talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. So they sometimes will slow your characters down just so you can have an exposition dump. There's going to be a lot of that throughout the game. The game also relies heavily on a very annoying technique that a lot of developers use. Again, going back to Uncharted, where you have to shimmy across a wall, or you have to squeeze through a narrow crack to try to get to the next area, so the game hides its loading screens in these areas. You're going to have a ton of elevator rides up and down. You're going to be having way too many sequences where the characters just are sliding down and sliding, and you're talking, all the characters are jibber jabbering while you're sliding and sliding and sliding and sliding and sliding to get to the next area. They do this way too often. Now, I understand why they do it. They don't want you sitting through actual cutscenes, so they make it seem like you're sitting through gameplay. But for people who know better, and I think a lot of people do know at this point, that stuff like that is just being used to mask loading areas. This game relies on it to an absurd degree. So if that's something that annoys you, I know some people can't stand that sort of thing. This game is loaded with that sort of thing. I would rather do that than sit through a loading screen. I understand why developers do it, but this game uses it as a crutch, I think, far too often. That is not the major problem. The major problem with the game is the combat itself is not very good. It's not very good at all. It wasn't until very late in the game where I actually started to get comfortable with the controls and the way you handle the other characters, because you have to control Drax and Gamora and Groot and Rocket while they are in combat, but you don't control the characters themselves. You just do call-outs. They have a list of different commands that you can go through that will execute different attacks. Groot mainly does crowd control, and then eventually, very, very late in the game, he will get a healing power. Gamora does good DPS damage to a single target. Rocket is a ranged character, and he can do heavy damage with his long-range stuff. He can drop cluster bombs, and his ultimate attack at the end is very powerful as well. Drax is mainly used as a staggering character, which doesn't come in too handy all the time because not all the enemies are susceptible to being staggered. But in general, you are probably the weakest character yourself. You just have a couple of guns that don't really do a ton of damage. You will get environmental skills attached to the weapon as you progress through the game. These aren't something you can unlock beforehand. It's just you will unlock a freeze attack at a certain story point. You will unlock a wind attack and a fire attack and a electrical attack, and these will all come as part of the story as you progress. And then different enemies will be able to be staggered or will have shields that you can drop down if you hit them with that particular type of element from Star-Lord's weapons. But in general, his weapons are not very strong. He doesn't do a ton of damage. The game really wants you to rely on using the other character's skills to get you through battle. The problem is these skills and the way the button inputs are used is really, really poorly done. They could have done a lot better to streamline the system. As it stands, you have to do first you have to aim at the enemy you want to execute an attack on, which when there's, say, 15 different enemies on the screen, it's going to prioritize the ones that are right in front of you. Maybe you don't want to prioritize one, you want to do one across the screen. Sometimes aiming at the character you want is going to be a little bit wonky. Once you selected the enemy you want to do an attack on, then you have to hold down one of the bumper buttons, select with a face button the character that you want to execute a command. That opens up another sub-menu, and then you have to select the attack that you want the character to use on the particular enemy. So it's basically, aside from aiming, it's still a 3-button input where it will slow down the flow of combat while you do this input, and then the character will be on a bit of a cooldown before you can use their skill again. This gets very annoying. It's very cumbersome, and again, like I said, it wasn't until very late in the game where I actually felt comfortable using the combat controls to execute commands from my companions. It is not well done at all. This is by far the worst part of the game, is the combat itself. Unfortunately, the combat is half the game. When you're not in a dialogue section, when you're not watching a cutscene, you're going to be in combat. The fact that the combat isn't very good really does drag down the experience because it's really more annoying than fun. There was never a single time in the game where I'm like, oh man, yeah, I feel so skilled doing this. I feel good about the combat moves I just pulled off. It really is just a matter of just holding down the button, and in fact, they even have an auto-aim, auto-lock button that you have to hold down, which will lock on to a particular enemy. That's how bad the combat is. It's just not very good at all. Even once I got comfortable with it, I still didn't really enjoy the combat sequences. They just tend to be pretty tedious. Some of the enemies will just stun lock your characters. They'll knock them down. You have to go heal them, and then while you're healing them, they'll be stun locking you. It just gets annoying. Combat is a low light of this game. It's just not good. I don't really have anything good to say about the combat itself, and it's really a shame, because for the most part, the rest of the game is, in general, pretty high quality. But the combat needed so much more work. I don't like the system that they implemented at all. I would have actually preferred if maybe they made it so you could switch between characters on the fly, like just hit a bumper button and then switch to another character and use them. Or maybe have a couple of different combo attacks, although the game does do that. Again, it's so random. You have special attacks that you can execute with your teammates, but a lot of it is down to RNG whether or not they're going to execute it. There's a couple of trophies and achievements that are attached to specific moves that you have to execute against specific enemies, and at times you just can't get the characters to trigger the moves you want them to do. If you want Drax to do a specific staggering move, he might not do it. It might never trigger in combat. If you want Groot to rip the arm off an enemy, it might not trigger. If you want Gamora to jump up and take out a particular airborne enemy, she might not do it. It's frustrating that they tried to rely on certain RNG aspects. I think they should have totally rethought how they did the combat in this game. It drags down the experience overall, and in my mind makes the game that much worse. It could have been a lot better if they just totally changed it with a different system altogether. Just abandon what you have here, leave it on the cutting room floor. It just doesn't work. I don't like the combat. Ugh, don't like it. And it's not as though the combat was difficult. I really didn't even die until I was very late in the game, and then I had one weird fight where it was just this kind of odd difficulty spike where I died 5 times in a row. Still don't really know what was going on there, but in general, after that, I once again didn't have any trouble. I had no trouble with the bosses, didn't have any trouble with the regular enemies, again, aside from that one spot. Even with the bad controls and the bad coordination between the teammates while you're doing the combat, it's not that challenging. Now, I did play on the default difficulty. I could have turned up the difficulty, yes. That's besides the point. When I review games, I play it on the normal difficulty because that is the difficulty that most people play it on. So yes, I could have turned it up, but in general, I don't think that would have helped either because the game itself, just the way the controls work, I didn't have any fun really during those combat sessions. One unique aspect to the combat that I did like is you have this meter that'll build up on the side of the screen while you're in combat, and if it maxes out, you can hit the bumper buttons and pull your teammates in for a huddle where it will completely pause the combat. Your teammates will come in on the screen and you'll have a conversation with them. They'll tell you how they feel about the specific combat scenario you're in right there. They make it seem like it's supposed to be catered to the situation you're in. In general, it's just randomized stuff where they'll either be really excited about the combat scenario you're in or they'll be down on themselves, and your job as the leader is to rally them and either get them refocused on the task at hand or to encourage them, bump them up to fight together as a unit. This, if you answer the question correctly, will give your entire team a damage boost for the rest of the combat scenario. If you fail it, you'll only get a damage boost for yourself. This doesn't really make or break the combat. It doesn't seem to change it that much either way. You can totally do without this mechanic at all if you don't want to deal with it. But it's there if you want to use it. It adds a little bit of spice to the combat scenarios, which is actually much needed because, again, the combat itself is the weak spot of the game. One of the other things you do with your characters as you go through the world, again, I'm going to come back to it again, just like Uncharted, you're going to have to be using the other characters in the game to be moving through the world. You're going to have to use Drax to smash holes through walls. You have to use Rocket to crawl into tight spaces so he might be able to unlock a door for you or maybe hack a panel that you can get into. You use Gamora to climb up to get into higher spots, and Groot can be used to extend bridges across large gaps where the team needs to cross. So you have to use your teammates to do different things in the game in order to progress. It does lend itself, of course, into the cohesion of the characters building themselves together up as a group. It all makes sense as far as that goes. But again, gameplay itself is not the star of the show. The star of the show is definitely the story itself and the spectacle of the world around you. The world is interesting, the story is interesting, and the game actually does give you dialogue choices throughout the game. They're generally just binary, choice A or choice B, but these can have some impact on how things play out. They won't change the story in a dramatic way. You're still going to be playing through the same chapters as me. You're still going to be having more or less the same exact story beats. But there are times where you can get a different item from certain characters. Certain NPCs might give you something that will help you progress throughout the game. Now, don't get this confused for an RPG. It's not like that at all. These choices aren't going to dramatically change anything throughout the game, but they can have different scenarios play out in different ways. But on the whole, you're going to be playing through the same chapters, same story beats, same overall story that everyone else is. But these dialogue choices, they add a little bit of something different that some of these other linear story-based games just don't have. So that was something that was a nice addition to the game. On the whole, the game, I think, is actually pretty solid. If you can overlook the problems with the button inputs, with the combat, if you can deal with that and get past that, there is a lot to like. There's a lot of unique looking areas. There's a lot of cool background lore that you can have. There's conversations you can have on your back on your ship with the different characters to add more background story to them so you can learn more about your crew. There's a lot that I do like about the game as far as that goes. In general, though, if you're not a fan of the Guardians of the Galaxy at all, I would say steer clear. But in general, I did like the game. I don't think it's bad. I think that overall, if you're a fan, you will like it. It's a good story. It's something that I would have to say if you're a Guardians of the Galaxy fan, maybe check it out, because I think that there'll be enough here. There's enough meat on the bone as far as the story goes where you might be able to sink your teeth into it. On the whole, though, again, if you are not someone who's interested in the world whatsoever, if you're someone who's just going to skip through all the cutscenes, skip through all the dialogue to get back to the combat, you're probably going to be extremely disappointed. The worlds look good, the planets look good, the creatures look good, the aliens look good. It all was interesting as far as that goes. When it comes to recommending it, the mileage is going to vary drastically depending on how invested you as a player are in the story and the characters. If you're someone who just doesn't care about story and you're only looking for the gameplay, I gotta say, you gotta give this a hard pass. I've seen people saying that this is a Game of the Year material. I wouldn't go that far. I do think it's a pretty solid product, though, if you like the Guardians of the Galaxy in general. But anyway, that's it from me, Coach Toolshed. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. Please subscribe if you want to stay in tune with the channel headed forward. And as always, keep it turned to 11.